Today is May 28th, 2014. My name is Martha Dick, and I'm interviewing Sharon Cole, who was involved in the 4 Mile Creek flood beginning September 11th, 2013. This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, and the interview is being filmed by Don Dick. Sherry, you have a lot of story to tell. Can you start off and tell us just some basics, like where and when you were born?
I was born in Pennsylvania, a small town, Mountaindale, Pennsylvania, in 1943. Home births were more common then. All the kids in my grandma's family were born at home, and I was too. And my husband and I moved to Boulder in January 1974 to the house that we lived in for the next 40 or so years. Unusual in Boulder for people to live in the same house, but we bought it in Fourmile Canyon. It wasn't in great shape. It was undoubtedly built by drunken miners, according to one of our neighbors, because it certainly wasn't a very straight house. It was crooked, and the door shut automatically because the wall was off by at least 4 inches from floor to ceiling. But anyway, we loved that house and improved it a lot, but not as much as it really needed to be improved. But in any case, the year after we moved here, we got a nice deal on another house, which was equally crooked, about a mile up the road, and that was our rental property for quite a long time. And during the Fourmile Fire, we stayed with friends in town, and one of our friends was a fire department fellow, and he let us know the next day that our house was one of the ones that burned. So oddly enough, the rental property did not burn. They were both equally what you'd say, all made out of wood and essentially fire traps, but fortunately there were people with appropriate fire gear and lots of water, and the rental house was preserved, saved, whatever. I guess that's just the luck of the draw, but for me it was a really good thing, because I did move back to my home area in 4 Mile last July. The 4 Mile Fire was Labor Day 2010, and through our insurance we found a rental place in Lyons, and liked the town and liked the people and liked the area, and our realtor took us all over the place to try and find another spot to buy, and so we did. We purchased a home in Lyons outside of the town in the following, after the 4 Mile Fire. It was the end of April in 2011, and we loved it there. It was very nice, but after my husband died, I did want to get back to my old neighborhood in 4 Mile, and it occurred to my massage therapist, not me, that it would be sensible to live in my rental house and only be a mile away from my old property that I do intend to build on, even have a building permit. That's all I have so far, but anyway, so I moved back to the rental place because my tenant, conveniently enough, moved back to Florida, and so it was empty. And it needed work, but it needed work from the time we bought it. And so there was always something to do there that needed to be done. Anyway, so I moved back July 3rd of 2013, July 3rd, and was working on fixing it up so that the innards of the house would be more livable, and various repairs needed to be done. And unfortunately, in retrospect, I didn't focus too much on the outside part of the house, but I didn't. That's the way it goes. And on the night of September 11th, when I was on my way, we had had a very wet summer. Lots of people mentioned that their gardens had never been better. You didn't have to water because nature was doing it for you. It seemed like it rained almost every few days, but the week before the flood, it really rained. I think every day. It was just soggy. And even so, living in a semi-arid climate since 1974, I always had fires on my mind more than floods. And of course, in Fourmile, after the fire, everybody was very concerned about the possibility of flooding in the damaged area, with good reason. I mean, you always saw on the news from Colorado Springs and various places that when the ground isn't stable because things have burned down, you know that that can be pretty risky for floods. Well, be that as it may, I wasn't really thinking about it too much, even though my cabin, the rental property, is at the bottom of a burned out area. It's amazing it didn't burn itself, but it didn't. Anyway, that evening my dog and I were coming home, and I went by community hospital through what seemed like a 2-foot puddle of water, and I thought, holy mackerel, that is really really sloshy. The storm drains must be having a really hard time. It still didn't really dawn on me what was about to come. I was thinking, this is really bad down here. And then I went home, and it was, raining probably at the time. It must have been raining, because I think I read later that it rained. I don't remember which was the one which day it rained, what we usually get in a whole year in a 24-hour period. But it was definitely raining very, very hard. And so when I got home, I didn't notice that the creek in front of my house was all that much higher. It was louder. But this rental property is close to the road. It doesn't have much of a yard. And on the other side of the road is where the creek is, and it's usually, maybe 4 feet below the road. And at that point, nothing had really changed that much with the flow, at least not right there. But that evening, 2 of my friends, one from Netherland and one from Erie, were calling me and saying, you really ought to move to higher ground because you're close to the creek and you're on the bottom of a potentially hillslide situation. And I just really didn't believe it, and I thought, nah, it'll be okay. And when did I leave? I did leave that night. Later, I don't remember getting the alert from the county until I was already up at my friend's house, which is about 5 miles further up the road in Sunset. And I have a couple friends up there, but Janet, the person I stayed with, lives on a hill at the very end of Sunset. Actually, there's another house or two in process above her. But in any case, she and her husband put in solar power several years back. I think it was in the 80s. And so she was a good choice because she was off the grid already. And of course, we did still have power at that point. But anyway, I got myself and my dog, and basically, I didn't even take any dog food. I just left, put the dog in the car, and cleaned out my refrigerator somewhat because I thought, well, we'll need stuff to eat depending on how long I'm there. And when I got to Janet's house, I thought, well, I don't think I have dog food. And so anyway, that evening we heard the I guess it's the reverse 911 call or whatever they call it, that is the flood warning, and they said move to higher ground, and it was very official sounding, and Janet and I were already cozied up in the bed, and we said, well, we got that taken care of. And she was never worried about flooding in her house because she said as high up on Fourmile Creek as she is, and as high up the hill above it, if her place flooded, Boulder would be history. So she was pretty casual, not casual exactly, but she was pretty comfortable, and I was comfortable too. So all night, well, not all night, because I sleep very soundly once I'm cozy. Nothing wakes me up. But I did hear the boulders rolling down the creek like I'm sure everybody else did. And it was so loud, I thought it was thunder. Well, of course, it was still raining. Some of it could have been thunder. But the next morning, it was still soggy, very soggy. And I think it was, yeah, it must have been still raining. That Thursday was my mother's birthday. And I was going to call her, but I decided I better go back to my house and get some dog food and get some more clothes and some other stuff to be camped up there for a few days, is what I thought. Well, on my way back to my house, this is I guess it's about 5 miles from Sunset to where my place is. You could certainly see all kinds of rivulets down the mountain coming down. The river was a lot higher. Little areas that never used to be streams were, rolling across the road with lots of water. And at my friend Pat's house, she lives about a half a mile or so west of where I live, and the creek was beginning to come across the road, not the regular Fourmile Creek, but I guess they call it Potato Gulch, right next to where she lives. And I don't think at that point in time, because this would have been like, I think I have my dates wrong, because when I came back, it was actually Friday the 13th. I must have not gone up there until Thursday. That's a blur to me, because I thought I went up Wednesday, the worst night. But I know the electricity was still on when I came back on Friday the 13th, because that was when the water was pouring in through the back of my house. And so it wasn't from the river, the Fourmile Creek rising and coming across the road to my house. It was pouring in the back from the hillside being all soggy and it was a really big puddle behind my house. I took pictures of it, and I called up my insurance agent. I think that was my first call. I said, what should I do? Should I take pictures? Because at the time, I was thinking that since I still had electricity, maybe I should start vacuuming it up, because I have a big wet vac, and I'm thinking, I have good rubber boots, right? I'm thinking, do I really want to plug in the electric vacuum cleaner? Maybe that wouldn't be such a smart idea. And then I decided it would be fruitless, because all this water was pouring in. Even if I had a giant bucket and a giant vacuum cleaner, I wasn't going to be able to make that big of a dent. So I thought, I have other priorities here. I better get my dog food and clean up this and that. And then I called. Oh, that was the day I was supposed to meet with my builder, because I had gotten my permit, my building permit, to rebuild the house that burned. I had gotten that permit at the end of August. And so this is like about a week later, the builder had arranged to meet me there. Well, obviously, nobody was going to meet anybody in Fourmile Canyon, and I didn't think I needed to call him, so maybe I don't remember actually if I did call him that day or not. But Bill and Janet both called me and said they are predicting that it's going to rain a whole bunch more, and if you're going to come up here, you better come up here pretty soon. And so in the late afternoon, after sloshing around my house doing whatever, I didn't accomplish very much, that's for sure. On Friday the 13th, I went up in time to be able to still drive from my house to Sunset. And the reason that's important is because in the meantime, that little creek by my friend Pat's house, which half of the time is not even a trickle, had turned into this raging torrent, and had carved a big chasm in the road, and you couldn't drive over it, not even with a little ATV. People tried afterwards. You could hike over it after a few days when the water came down, but it was pretty hairy for Pat, her sister who was visiting from California, and her next door neighbor Gail, and I'm not sure who else, but fortunately for them, some people who they still are there in one of the houses between my place and Sunset, are climbers, rock climbers. They have all kinds of gear, carabiners and lots of good ropes and a sling or two, like portable ladders. It's good equipment. They used it to shore up their propane tank, because in the meantime, the propane tank, the bank on which the tank was being dissolved out from under it. Basically, it was slipping, and they put a bunch of ropes and carabiners and whatever they needed to, and shored it up with big rocks. But anyway, they managed to let's see, they managed to get it safe, so it was staying put. And it was so interesting at the time, because half of the people that were my neighbors I didn't even know. I know them to wave to and say hi, but I don't even, I didn't even remember their names. They have two little girls, really cute kids, and they were very helpful. And they did rescue Pat and her whole entourage, including her bird. She didn't have any cats or dogs, but she has a macaw, a pet macaw. I forget his name too, but he's been one of her. She really likes birds, and she's had a few over the years, but he's been her buddy for a long time. He got to ride in the helicopter, and that. Let me think. When they had set up the ladder wrapped with rope around a couple of trees and rocks over that chasm where the river had come down that gulch that never had been a river before, although Pat was always concerned about it, and she had a bunch of sandbags, and she was just hoping it would hold. Well, it would have, but like a lot of other things that you don't plan on, some trees and some rocks and some debris blocked it off up where it was, and then it just kind of veered into the edge of her house, underneath her house, and it really looked like her house might cave in into the creek. And it's hard to imagine, because even the next day, I think it was the next day, it was either Saturday or Sunday, Saturday, Bill Jones, one of the neighbors in Sunset, who's lived there quite a long time, and he and I walked down to my place, and we could get as far as Pat's driveway, which was now a river, a chasm. You couldn't, you didn't want to jump over it or wade through it. The water was too intense. In fact, actually, the walk on the way down was pretty intense, and part of the road had been eaten away, and you could see the railroad tracks that used to go up there, and then ended in, well, it didn't end, it teed in Sunset. Part goes up to Gold Hill, and the other part goes up to Sugarloaf. You could see railroad tracks in other places too, here and there.
When would those tracks have been laid and used?
I think in the late 1800s. Soon after, they did have not like tourist tours exactly. I'm sure the miners used them, but I think people actually did ride up there and ride all the way up to the picnic grounds on Mount Alto, because it is a very pretty road, pretty drive. And in fact, the Switzerland Trail, that's what it's called, on both sides, I think. The Mount Alto Road that goes to Gold Hill, and then over to Ward. Well, after Fourmile was cut in at least two places, Salina was basically washed out. People have seen those pictures. Pretty amazing, the damage. But Wall Street was cut off too. There were like little islands, and so we knew what was going on in Sunset, and we knew sort of what was going on in other places in the canyon, because two of the people who live in Sunset have generators, and then of course Janet was off the grid anyway, but she doesn't have a TV, and we would all gather together at mostly at Hal Crutchfield's house, Hal and Allison, sort of the the self-designated rescue people. They're the ones who drove out the first day that it was sunny, which I think was Saturday morning. That was the day that Bill and I took our walk down to Pat's and to see if we could get to my house. But by the time we got to Pat's and saw how bad it was, even though it was only another half a mile, and I sort of wanted to check it out, but I sort of didn't. So, and Bill hadn't had breakfast, and it was way after lunch by then, and I thought, well, it's silly for him. He's a Boy Scout leader. He knows he should eat, but he didn't. And so we teased him big time about not being prepared. But we walked on back, and we were just blown away by everybody says this, but it's so true, the water. I mean, Fourmile Creek is just a small creek. It's not as small as that raging current that was right next to Pat's house. Normally, but to see how far it could go and how deep it was cutting different places and things. Well, in the meantime, of course, the bridge, which is just a little ways east of my house to the property that is on the other side, that bridge had totally collapsed and twisted because major trees and rocks had banged up against it for such a long time that the bottom of it was eroded and twisted. These concrete structures that look like they would last indefinitely. It's nothing. It's amazing how powerful Mother Nature is. And anytime I ever flew into New York City and I would look down at those bridges and see all the lights, and it looked just like a spider web, fragile. And it's just amazing, the power of Mother Nature when she's gonna unload. We've all seen the pictures of tornadoes or fires or floods. Seen them from up above and from down below. But anyway, yeah, Friday was the day that I walked through the house and all the rugs were squishy and the water was running right out the door, like the movie The River Runs Through It. And I'm thinking, what a mess this is going to be. Well, in many ways I was lucky because it wasn't dirty water, it was just water. So I didn't have mud damage or any kind of sewage damage like lots of people did. I just had water. And of course, when rugs are wet for long periods of time, when I came back Saturday, it wasn't that squishy, it wasn't flowing anymore, all the rugs were wet. So Janet and I pulled them all out and corralled a couple of bikers that came by to help us lift the rugs. And conveniently enough, I had a kennel for my dog, and that made a good place to lay the rugs. Not that we really wanted them to dry and reuse them, we just wanted to get them away from the house, and they were really heavy. And anyway, so the house dried itself out pretty well, but there was mold, and and I did have to have a lot of work done on it to get rid of the mold, and anything that was porous material had to get thrown out. It was interesting because, I did have flood insurance. I wasn't going to renew it, but I decided that it would be really unpleasant if anything should happen, and the house isn't worth much, but it's not worth zero. So I thought I better just pay the money, and I talked to my insurance agent, and because the price that I got from we started getting flood insurance right after the fire, and the price was around $360 a year, and when I got the bill for last year, it was $3,000 something. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. But I was almost going to do it, but I thought to ask Kathy what she thought, and she found me a better deal. Not for the company, I guess, but a better deal for me. So it wound up to be only $400 and some dollars. And boy, was I ever glad I had it. So I called the insurance fellow for that. That's completely different from your home insurance, as everybody probably knows by now. But this fellow was from Georgia. He was a young guy, and he had last been in Colorado when he was 8 years old, and he was thrilled to come to Colorado. And we tried to call each other, but you know, the phones were out, the electricity was out. I was only back to town for the first time, I guess it was Tuesday, and we couldn't get in touch with each other, but then we finally did, and he was leaving the next day. I said, and he was very anxious to come up and take measurements and take pictures and do the insurance thing, and I said, well, we can do it, but the problem is we have to go over the Switzerland Trail. It'll take about an hour. It's not the greatest, it's an old railroad grade. It's not the best road in the best of circumstances. Then we go down through Gold Hill, down Sunshine Canyon, and I can meet you in Boulder, and I'll drive you back up because they're trying to limit traffic. And he was fine with that. That's fine. I said, you have to have old shoes because we'll have to, we can drive to a mile, about a half a mile or a mile from my house. Then we have to go down a ladder across the creek, the new creek, which is the road, the road, which is the creek, whatever. Oh, that's fine. I'm okay with that. And when I told the same story to the FEMA guy about a week later, he said, we'll just call it unreachable, and we'll call you in another week or so and see how we're doing. But all the way up there, he's taking pictures of how beautiful it was, except for the dead trees from the fire. But he didn't, you know, he thought it was just absolutely gorgeous. And every now and then he'd say, I mean, I'm sorry you got flooded out and all that, but this is really cool. So it was really kind of funny. But he did a great job as far as making a drawing of my house, measurements of everything, what got damaged, what would need repaired, and did it all the way they know how to do it. And it was, you know, very helpful. And I now have a good drawing of my house, which I never did because mine was sort of sketchy. But anyway, let's see. So traffic, the first day that you could potentially drive up over Switzerland Trail and see, because you couldn't go up towards Sugarloaf because of the creek had messed up, the culverts were all damaged. You couldn't go that way unless you were walking, although somebody did come down the Sugarloaf Road in the middle of the night, either Saturday or Sunday, in a pickup. I did hear about that. I'm not sure exactly how they managed it, but they did. But going up through Gold Hill, it was like bumper to bumper practically, because it wasn't so bad on Switzerland Trail. I think there was only one time when I got somebody coming up while I was going down, and I had to back up a little for a little ways. But there was traffic from Netherland and traffic from Ward, I guess. All sorts of people were taking the road that leads through Gold Hill down Sunshine Canyon. And so it was a pretty good road in terms of, you know, ability to get through. But for all the people who normally don't have much traffic on that road, it was really quite an ordeal for some time. And I really appreciated the school kids. They had drawn all kinds of pictures and stuff around the Gold Hill School, but the best one was, "Welcome to our town, please slow down." And because people did, when they could, go as fast as they was reasonable. That's what everybody does. But you had to be pretty cautious. And I am so grateful that that there weren't any significant or severe accidents that I'm aware of, because there could have been, with all the different trucks and all the different rescue vehicles and fire department. Oh, on Saturday, before my neighbor Pat and her bird and her entourage got rescued, we cleared a helicopter space because some other people were being picked up. Or actually, I think that was Sunday, because she knew that we shared pictures and shared stories about, and I saw pictures of her and her friends walking over that ladder with all that water underneath. It wasn't that far down, but it would have seemed like it was that far down. It was at least 10 feet, and all this water. They did use belays. They had ropes on them just in case, but nobody fell in. Nobody was injured. It was a pretty amazing thing. The people in the National Guard that landed the helicopter, and we were all gaga taking pictures. Like, it's not every day you see one of those in Fourmile. But they sure did what they needed to do. And the first day, the rest of us, those of us who had vehicles were really interested in keeping them at hand, if possible. For Pat, she had a vehicle, but it couldn't get across the chasm, and going down canyon, not just Wall Street was isolated, but Salina too. You couldn't have, there was no way to drive, so she fortunately had friends and family in town. Most people did. It was, it's truly amazing what people are able to do during a tragedy, an emergency, a natural disaster, whatever, unnatural disaster, because, you know, the power is out. All the stuff in your freezer is going to be no good in a few days. So people were leaving large amounts of food. I know lots of people said that they felt like in some ways it was like a feast and a party, because why not? You had to use it up or throw it out, leave it for the bears, whatever. So lots of freezers and refrigerators got cleaned out, and people who had to leave left many supplies to the people who were staying. Let's see. In the meantime, after Janet doesn't stay there all winter. She usually closes up her place and goes and spends the winter months with friends in either Arizona or Florida or someplace, friends and family. And so she was planning on leaving probably October, but her exit got moved up a little since there was no real reason to be coming back. She had to go to a nephew's wedding and was going to take her daughter. So I knew I needed to find another place to stay, because I wasn't going to be able to stay in my my cabin until it got all dried out and destroyed all of the mold stuff Actually, at that point, I didn't know how much there was, but fortunately, I have really good friends, Evelyn and Dick Armstrong, who live on Norwood, since they had that place built in the 60s. And although some of their neighbors had flood damage, and quite a few people in the North Broadway, Upland, Violet to 19th Street area, a lot of damage there with mud. I stayed with them from I think it was around the 28th of September when Janet was leaving, and also fortunately for me, they liked me and my dogs, so we stayed there, and I really thought it would only be a few months, but what with one thing or another, it wound up, I only moved back to my Fourmile house at the end of March, and I wasn't fully moved in yet then, so it was probably more like April, because so many different things had to be fixed. Well, before they could be fixed, they had to be moved out, and so my house was gutted down to the 2x4s most places where there were 2x4s. This is an old mountain cabin we're talking about here, but the people who took care of the removal process and the dehumidifier, that was such a strange thing to have a dehumidifier in Colorado. 3 of them in my house to dry everything out and get rid of the mold, and then they put down the appropriate stuff before it got rebuilt. When we were surprised, because I guess when you live in the mountains you get used to being fairly independent, and you like that, but then again at the same time it's a very heartwarming sight to see some county road equipment coming up to rebuild your road, which is now the river, because the bridge, as bridges often do, turned into a dam, the bridge that was across the road from my house, and the river went, because water goes wherever water can, and it turned almost a right turn in front of the bridge, or west of the bridge, and went right into the roadbed. So for a while, I had, because it cut down into the roadbed, and where my property had been roughly 2 feet or so above the road, 2 feet, 2.5 feet, it was probably more like 6 or 7 feet. I had cliff-front property for a brief period of time. It was so strange. And I had a picture of where the telephone equipment right near the telephone pole had been pulled out by the water, and it was just sticking out, wires sticking out, and just to keep it from being run into and pulled out further, I put these bungee cords around it and hooked it up to the telephone pole, which looked like it was in a solid spot, and they stayed there for the longest time, even with all the road work that was being done, because I think it was like Tuesday, the following week, Tuesday, it was not very long. We thought it would take forever for them to, work on rebuilding the road, and what were they going to do? Well, the only place for the creek to be was where the creek was, unless you were going to just forget about having a road. So sure enough, there was a D9 cat at the other end of where, as far as I can see, coming my way, and I was so happy to see him pushing in dirt and creating a road there, because it was quite amazing. The drainage there is still a little iffy, but that's true for a lot of places. But my house where I lived in Lyons was cut off. The road on the way up to my house was okay, but the Little Thompson, which is normally a fairly tiny trickle except in the spring certain times, and I'm sure it's washed out that little section before, but I heard from a neighbor, one of my old neighbors there, that the bottom part there was 150 feet across, he was estimating. And I couldn't get to it because Lyons was closed off, and I knew there wasn't anything really I could do anyway, but I assumed, or I was hoping, that my other house would be okay. The house that Ed and I had bought the April after the fire was on a hill, and there were two really good drainage areas on either side of it. And so I hoped, barring any landslides or what have you, that it was okay, and indeed it was. The only problem for all my neighbors and me, if I had still been living there, was access, because you couldn't get to it unless you were willing to hike up the other side. There's really no round trip egress from that area. It's a road in, and it's the same road out. And there was a huge amount of damage, of course, from the St. Vrain just pouring through. This area is on the other side, the north side of Apple Valley Road, and it's 11 miles in where I live, 11 miles from Lyons, from the town of Lyons. But so much damage there, it was really quite amazing. And I could, well, it was kind of odd because I had, my driver's license said I still lived in Fourmile. I had changed it to Lyons, just written it in on the back of my license, but they were being pretty strict about who could drive in and who couldn't. Fortunately, my fishing license had my Lyons address on it, and they didn't say anything about it one way or the other. I don't know how big of a deal that would have been, but it never ceases to amaze me. I mean, I probably drove up to that property maybe 3 or 4 times the next couple weeks once I could get there, and it just amazed me how much damage and how different it looked, and you could hardly remember exactly how it had been previously because it looked so very different. All those beautiful homes and that pretty area down by the river, just inundated by somebody else's yard, mud, fields flowing. Anyway, so I sent an email to somebody. I'm not that, I hadn't been all that big on emails, and my typing skills are marginal, but it was kind of a long email, and I said, I have the dubious distinction of owning 3 different properties, none of which I can get to. And then in the meantime, I forgot to say, I remembered the storage locker that I had rented on North Broadway, because the stuff that was in my Lyons house wasn't all going to fit into my Fourmile cabin that I had moved back into. So of course I had a rental cabin, or I mean a rental unit there for my stuff, but the stuff that will presumably go into my my other Fourmile house when it gets rebuilt. Okay, so guess what? That storage locker was all mudded. So, and they actually, I think they called it just a total loss because the roof fell in, part of it. That did not happen in my storage unit. And fortunately, part part of the things that I had stored in the storage locker were tires, and so a lot of stuff was on top of the tires, and who really cared if the tires got muddy? So that wasn't a really big issue, but the insurance agent said that my policy did cover stuff, and so we took pictures of that, and then some friends and I had a work party and had shovels and masks and dug it out, and that was pretty sad, and I had great appreciation and sympathy for people who had to deal with a lot of mud, because it's you don't think it's ever going to get clean. I can't imagine what it would have been like for people to walk down into their basements that were half full of, or more than half full of mud. But time passes, and you just keep plugging away and cleaning up. I was so grateful for friends and a place to stay. Such good people. Your friends are your family. And I had forgotten that my phone, my house phone in the rental cabin, my new home, was getting messages, because I didn't have an answering machine anymore. I had signed up for the CenturyLink automatic message thing. And so when it finally dawned on me, I probably have messages on that, because that's done in some central place. It's not on my phone. So I called, and oh my gosh, I had like 27 messages. And I was just appalled, because I thought, that would have been helpful if I thought of that earlier, and then people wouldn't have been worried. But in any case, that is a handy thing, not to have to rely on an answering machine that's dependent on your electricity. So, and since then I've thought, I really do need to get a phone that plugs into a regular phone line. We had that at our other house, so even when the electricity went off, assuming the phone lines didn't go down too, you could still get your phone service. But I haven't done that yet. One disaster at a time, I guess. It's strange how some people get more organized about what they're going to have, extra stuff in their car, or extra coats or extra things to. It's a good thing to pay attention to stuff like that, because you never know when things are going to happen. Although you can sort of plan that if it's been raining for a week, and you live in a burned out area, there is a potential for your hillside sliding. So I might have thought of my escape route earlier than I did. But so through it all, my dog has been amazing as far as agreeable to whatever's happening. She's always been kind of a good companion that way throughout my husband's illness. And are we going to just wait here and stay here, or are we going to live in this house? And she's done very well. And my friends are, amazingly enough, after 6 months staying with them, I didn't think. I did get some money from FEMA for housing, which was really nice and helpful, and I passed that on to my friends because that seemed only fair. They were the ones that were providing the housing. And And I did move my other truck. I have 2 vehicles, and I moved that truck to higher ground, but I didn't take it all the way up to Sunset. Let me think. We decided as a community, the people that were helping each other out and visiting, getting together, the 2 people that have generators in Sunset, we used to gather at their place at 6 o'clock, and I used their computer because I didn't have mine at the time. Let's see. Yeah, the community certainly did come together in an amazing way. And the fire department, of course, has been extremely helpful getting information and emails and stuff out as to what's happening with cleanup and who needs to do what. It is like the fire, the time after the fire, the cleanup, the long-term recovery is the tricky part, I guess. But we didn't move here till 74, but I heard stories about the 69 flood and how neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other since they'd moved there were able to communicate during that time. And this one was certainly an amazing adventure. And it's amazing to me now to see how very quickly they were able to restore the roads to a passable condition so that people didn't have to spend a whole hour and a half commuting to wherever they worked, from the ones who lived in Cold Creek Canyon or the ones who lived in Nederland. You are so used to the normal route that you take, the way you have to go, and to have it be suddenly 3 times as long or even just twice as long is just quite an ordeal for people. I am fortunate that being retired, I didn't have to worry about getting to work, and that was a good thing. Having the flood insurance was a good thing. Having some wonderful friends was a good thing. I really missed my husband too, because although he had been ill for a long time, and certainly nobody wants a disaster, but I was thinking about, he had been a ham radio fellow for years and years, since his teens actually, and I'm sure he would have really liked to have been able to help with the communication. So I was really sorry he wasn't around to be able to do that. On the other hand, since he wasn't as well and not as able to do that, maybe it was just as well that he didn't get to experience the real deal. Because I'm sorry.
It sounds like maybe you've just recently had the best experience of the whole flood, and that is you moved back into your restored cabin.
Yeah, that's very true. And I, since it is an old cabin, I've had several projects to work on, but truthfully, although I would have rather not had the honor, it is a much better place than it was, and the back wall is definitely shored up.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. We were fortunate enough not to have the experience, but having listened to you speak, it gives us a feeling of how much courage and how much thought and consideration for others that went into your own personal experiences. Thanks.
Thank you.
Are we stopped okay?